Cool. All right, thank you very much. Hi, my name is Femke, and today I want to share a story with you about creating a product experience for a foreign market. And when I started on this project for a foreign market, I learned a lot of things. First, I found out that I was pretty naive. I thought it would be really easy to just create what I thought was the best product or best design experience, and then just kind of translate it and put it out in that other market. I thought maybe we'd have to do a bit of research, a little bit of testing, but that for the most part it would be no different than designing an experience for a market that I'm familiar with. And of course, that's not the case, and so hopefully my talk today will share some insights into that. But let's start first from the beginning with a bit of backstory. So I currently work as a product designer at Uber. I'm based in Amsterdam, and I work on the payments team. And this means that we look after everything payments related. So it includes some things on the back end, like the whole ecosystem of how we move money around, how we pay drivers, but it also includes some front-end experiences. For example, adding a new payment method or choosing how you want to pay for your ride when you take a trip. And when I started at Uber a little over a year ago, I was given a project for the Latin American market. Now, I'm a Kiwi. Starting on this project, I'd never been to Latin America before. I wasn't very familiar with the Latino market or culture or customs, so I knew that I was going to get thrown into the deep end pretty quickly. But to give some more context to my story, first, I want to share that in Latin America, you can actually pay for your Uber ride with cash. Now, most of you probably know Uber as this sort of digital, seamless payments magical experience where you can take a trip, and at the end of the ride, you can just leave the car, right? You don't have to worry about paying, giving money to your driver. It all kind of works magically. But as we wanted to grow and expand Uber, we realized that there were some markets that we were really struggling to capture because not all markets are digitally connected or have digital payments. So in markets like Latin America, credit card penetration is pretty low. So we knew that if we wanted to continue growing, that we had to introduce cash. And when we did introduce cash, we saw suddenly that trips were being taken out to surrounding neighborhoods and areas of big cities that beforehand there were no trips going there. So suddenly we'd kind of unlocked this new gap in the market or this new potential of growth. And suddenly new people were coming onto the platform and being able to get transportation when they weren't able to before. So I want to kind of walk you through very briefly kind of the ecosystem or the supply chain of how payments kind of moves throughout Uber. So let's first look at a digital trip, which I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with. So let's imagine that you're a rider, you live in Mexico, and you take a trip that costs you 100 pesos. So 100 pesos is automatically deducted from your digital payment method of choice, and that complete trip fare, 100 pesos, goes directly to Uber. Now, of course, Uber doesn't keep all of this money. We have to pay our drivers. And so depending on how much goes to the driver depends per market, but let's say for this example, it's 75%. So Uber then pays 75 pesos to the driver, and the driver receives that digitally. They receive it in their account, in their app, like as a digital balance. And then from there, they can cash that out at any time to sort of pay themselves. But let's look at how this money movement works for cash. So same thing, you're a rider, your trip costs 100 pesos. So you pay 100 pesos, but this time you're paying it directly to the driver. So the driver receives 100 pesos in their pocket. So now this poses the question of how does Uber collect the service fee from this trip? Somehow, 25 pesos has to be given to Uber. So we end up with this situation where we need to somehow collect this money from our drivers who are taking cash trips. And one way to do this is to take it from their digital balance. So most of you have probably never seen the driver app before. This is a look into the earnings section of the app, where the driver can see how much they currently have that they can cash out. So you see their digital balance here, and this comes from trips that they've taken. So you could say that we could collect it from this. And we do that. It kind of looks like this. Let's imagine that a driver has 100 pesos on their balance. They owe us 25 from a cash trip that they took, and then their balance goes down to 75. This is very simple math. And we do this today. But this doesn't work for every driver, because a driver who takes a lot of cash trips often has a negative balance. So if we collected from this negative balance, the driver's balance would go more negative. And this ends up being a cycle, right? We could keep doing this, and you see that the driver's balance goes more and more negative. So this is not a very good or sustainable option to collect this money from our drivers. So this was the problem. How do we collect money owed from our drivers without letting them sink more and more negative? So we had a solution in place when I came onto this project, but it was pretty suboptimal. Our local operations team were manually sending emails to drivers who owed us a substantial amount of money, and attached was an invoice that drivers had to pay. And this was kind of working. Like, we were collecting some money from our drivers, but it was not a very great experience. Drivers were confused. A lot of them don't use email, so they never saw the message, et cetera, et cetera. And it was kind of no surprise to us that they wanted more control. You know, these drivers wanted more control over how much to pay, when to pay, where to pay, et cetera. And if you think about it, for a lot of these drivers, driving is their livelihood. You know, some of them really depend on Uber as a way to make a living and to provide for their family. And so we knew we needed to give them more control, because if we didn't, a lot of them would continue sinking more and more negative and then risk being blocked from the platform altogether. So this was really important for us to make sure that we gave drivers an optimal way to pay so that they could continue driving. So this was kind of my brief, right? Like, how can we collect money from our drivers? How can we do that sort of digitally in the app? And so I had a lot of assumptions going into this project. The first, hopefully you see this with the contrast, but the first says tech is magic. So, you know, I come from Amsterdam. I can come here today in London, turn on my phone, connect to the internet, be good to go. I can walk into a store and pay for anything, even though I don't have a UK bank account or banking card. You know, tech here is pretty seamless and it's pretty synchronous. But that's not always the case. You know, if you go to somewhere like Nigeria or even Mexico, it's not quite as magical as we expect it to be here in Europe. Another assumption I had was that all drivers are the same. So this, again, was a naive point. When I started at Uber, I had this image in my mind of a driver driving in San Francisco. She drives 5 days a week. She makes good money. She provides for her family. And her motivations are, you know, earning, making a living. But this isn't the case, right? We have drivers all over the world, and they all have different goals, different motivations, different needs. And so one driver in San Francisco can be very, very different from a driver in Brazil, for example. And my other assumption was that in order to kind of localize our experience, all we sort of had to do was translate it. And I'll show you why that was wrong later in this talk. So I want to walk you through a little bit the design process that we took for this project, and hopefully you'll get some learnings along the way. And so the first step is research. We always begin our project with research, and we have dedicated user researchers on our team who help us organize this part of the process. And we wanted to first create this experience for Mexico. So we went there. We went to Mexico, and we did a lot of different user testing, user research, spent a lot of time talking to our drivers, but also to our local operations team there. Some of the different types of research we do, just to give you an insight, the top left image there is us doing drive-alongs, where we literally will order a ride, get in the car with the driver, surprise, we work at Uber, can we interview you? And for the most part, that goes well. It's a kind of fun way to just take a trip, talk to the driver, we just end up driving all over the city, it's really fun. Another thing we do in the top right there is roundtable sessions, where we actually get drivers to come in, and we have a group discussion about a particular topic. So here we were talking to them about like having a negative balance, owing Uber money, taking cash trips, etc. And then, of course, the bottom right image, you can see we do like one-on-one user testing with prototypes. So we were doing this research, and we actually ended up going to Mexico 3 times. Every time we went, we learned more and more, and it was so valuable that we would come back to the team in Amsterdam, iterate, explore, and then go back to Mexico to test again. And some of the insights were super interesting. For example, We often heard a message around, I often contact support because I don't understand why my balance has gone negative. So, there were drivers driving, seeing a negative balance and having no idea why, or no idea what it means, or no idea what to do about it. Another common theme we heard was, I've never had a negative balance before, so I've never owed Uber money before. And this was kind of ironic because all of the drivers in that photo were invited to that session because they had a negative balance. So a lot of the time, these drivers didn't even know, right? They had no idea. They were not aware that they were in this situation. So of course, how can we expect them to get themselves out of it? And then lastly, why would I have to pay Uber knowing that they can take it from my digital balance? And as I showed before, this is true. We can take it from your digital balance, but not in the case where your balance is negative. So we started out by setting ourselves some constraints on this project. Now, as I said, this project is for Latin America. In this case, we were looking at Mexico as our first sort of market to launch in. And now, in Mexico, it's a very cash-heavy country. People still rely on cash as ways to pay their bills, pay their utilities. So we knew that we had to provide like a physical cash collection option for these drivers because collecting it digitally wasn't going to be good enough. So we decided to partner with OXXO. OXXO is kind of like a 7-Eleven style convenience store. There's thousands of locations all across Mexico. And we decided to partner with them because in our research, we heard that drivers mentioned OXXO as a way that they currently pay their bills. And they do this through something called OXXO Pay, where they get a code from, let's say, their electricity provider. They go into the OXXO store, show the code to the cashier loads something, and then they pay the bill, the invoice, to the cashier over the counter, and then OXXO eventually sends it to the provider. So we figured this was a pretty good thing for us to try out as well. So we decided to partner with OXXO and OXXO Pay to collect, and that would allow our drivers to pay for their negative balance with cash. But a constraint of this is that we would have asynchronous feedback. So it can take up to 48 hours for OXXO to process the payment, send it to Uber, so it wasn't going to be live synchronous feedback. And we were a little bit nervous about this. The next step was testing and exploration. So we did all of this research, we had some constraints, we knew we were going to use OXXO. And so we created a prototype. And essentially, in this prototype, the driver gets a notification to pay. Then they can enter or decide themselves how much they want to pay. When they continue, we'll generate a unique code for them that they can use in an OXXO store. So at this step, they have to physically go to an OXXO store, show this code to the cashier, and pay them. Once they did that, we'd tell them that their payment is being processed and to wait a couple days while we receive and clear the money. So one of the things I immediately noticed when I put this in front of our drivers is that they would just tap, tap, tap through the flow. They did not read it, and they were not really understanding or following any of the instructions. They were very curious. They wanted to see what the next step was, what was coming up, right? I mean, I've done this before too. You're really impatient and you want to get to the end of something. So they did this as well. And so what would happen is they would end up on this last screen, processing, where it tells you to wait 48 hours, having never actually paid. So they were sort of sitting on the couch, tapping through, oh great, my payment is processing. But they haven't paid at all because they didn't go to an OXXO store. And we even heard from drivers that at this step, they would pick up the phone, call Uber support and ask them, hey, why am I still waiting? I got to the end of this, my balance should be updated. So this was kind of a hit in the face for me, and I kind of realized that I had been trying really hard to predict the behavior that our drivers would have in this experience. And I realized I was doing that because I saw our drivers as users. And now if you think of the term as users, we use this a lot in design as like, this ideal person. They're going to perfectly go through my experience. They know exactly what to do. They're very logical in thinking. They don't make many decisions. You can kind of narrow them through this path of what you want them to do. But actually, our drivers are not users. They are humans. And humans are unpredictable, right? They have their own decision making. They have their own emotions. They decide themselves what they want to do. They're super curious. And so as much as I could try to create this perfect step-by-step linear flow, it was very unpredictable as to what they were going to do. So the next step, refinement. So the first thing we did was add a pre-education flow to the experience. So as I showed in the research earlier, some drivers didn't realize that they owed money, they didn't realize what this meant or what they had to do, so we added some pre-education around making sure our drivers are aware that this is a thing. The second thing we did, in order to combat the sort of tap, tap, tap experience, we added an ability to start over. So once a driver gets to the end of the flow, we added a start over button, and drivers could start a new payment again if they wanted to, in case they actually didn't pay for real. And then we also added the ability to view their code that they had previously generated. So in case they didn't need to start over completely again, they were happy with the amount they had entered, let's give them a way to view the code from the end of the flow so that they can go into an OXXO store, show it, and pay for real. The other thing we did was add a bit of friction. So as I said, for this experience to work, drivers need to physically go to a store to pay. And it was clear that that wasn't super obvious. So we added this intermediary step, which I admit it's adding complexity. We added complexity and friction to this flow, but we knew that we needed it because we knew that we needed to better clearly communicate the expectation. So then it was localization. We created our experience, we felt confident about the design, we tested the updated versions, and now we needed to localize it for the market. And I've been showing everything in English just for demonstration, but launching this in Mexico and eventually Brazil means that we have to look at Spanish and Portuguese. So I focused a lot on translation when it came to localizing this product. And you can see here's an example of how we did the translation. So in the left-hand column we have English, and then we have Spanish in the middle and Portuguese on the right. Now, what happened here was that our translators were literally translating word for word the English copy. There was no screens, there was no visuals, they didn't have context on what the project was about, they just were translating words. And of course, when you do this, you miss some context, right? And here's an example of an error we actually had due to the way that we conducted this. So on the left-hand side, we see in English, didn't pay, you have an existing payment being processed, are you sure you want to start again? So this is in the case you got to the end, and you want to pay for real this time. And then on the right, we have it in Portuguese, and it says, basically, I'm not going to read it in Portuguese, sorry, but basically what it says is payment not realized or not actualized, and then you have an existing payment processing, are you sure you want to start again? So this is really confusing. It says your payment was not realized, but then the next line says you have an existing payment. So that's kind of confusing, right? And so we saw a lot of errors in our user testing sessions where drivers would get to the screen and be completely confused and not sure what to tap on. So that really skewed some of our results. And what I kind of realized also in this is that localization is more than just translation. So of course we need to translate the copy, but there's also other things that need to be translated or localized as well, like symbols or imagery or icons or just general context. You know, of course we could have an icon that has a dollar symbol to symbolize money, but not everybody uses a dollar symbol. Even in the UK, you don't. So I realized that what we should have been focusing more on is this concept of transcreation. And that is adapting a message from one language to another while maintaining its intent, style, tone, and context. So it's not just about language. In fact, sometimes it's not about language at all. I live in the Netherlands and I don't speak Dutch. So for me, English is super useful. So it's about how can we maintain the intent, right? How can we maintain the intent and communicate this message across into another culture while keeping the context? So some of my learnings from this project that I want to share with you. The first is to be adaptable. Now, it's really hard to predict all of the user stories, the edge cases, the scenarios, and the things that might come up when you start a project. So my advice is to be adaptable, be open to change, be open to changing things along the way, doing something unexpected, trying something that sounds wild or sounds crazy as you're going through the process. Secondly, I learned that users are human, right? As I said before, I was thinking of our drivers as very logical thinkers, logical users, but in fact, they're not at all. They have their own decision making, they can decide for themselves, their emotions also play a big part into it, so consider that as well. And then lastly, kind of obvious, but a good reminder, is that culture isn't universal. We need to have more and better empathy for the people that we're designing for, especially if they're in another market. So what does all of this really mean for you, right? I've been sharing my story, my learnings, the things that I have learnt from this process, but how can you sort of take this away? And I think the main takeaway that I want you to have from this is that it's not enough to just stand behind your desk and create what you think is the perfect experience. Right? Designing a good experience is already hard, but designing a good experience for a completely other market or a foreign market is even harder, and you cannot do that from behind your desk. So I really encourage all of you to go out there, talk to them in real life, see how they live, see what they do, learn more about the market, and that way you can get the right empathy and the right cultural thinking into your products as you go forward. Thanks very much for listening.